I knew the HOA was shady, but I never thought they'd outright steal from me. Yet here I was, staring at a legal notice that claimed the small strip of land I owned next to my house had been sold by them. I gripped the paper so tight my knuckles turned white. "This has to be a mistake," I muttered. But deep down, I knew better. It was that woman, Clarissa Ziegler, the HOA president. She had been harassing me ever since I refused to pay for some ridiculous community improvement fund. Now, she had the audacity to sell my land, claiming it was part of the HOA's jurisdiction. I stormed into the HOA office, a small building at the edge of the neighborhood that they treated like some kind of government headquarters. Clarissa sat behind the desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the wood. She looked up and sighed dramatically. "Xander, if you're here to complain, you'll have to take it up with the legal department," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "You mean your cousin who pretends to be a lawyer?" I shot back. "Cut the nonsense, Clarissa. You sold my land, that's theft." She gave a little laugh, the kind that made my blood boil. "Oh, Xander, you really should read the fine print. When you bought your house, you agreed to the HOA's expansion rights. That strip of land was annexed last year. We had every right to sell it." I leaned forward, planting my hands on her desk. "You're lying. I never agreed to anything like that." She slid a folder toward me. "The paperwork says otherwise." I flipped it open, scanning the documents. My name was on them, but something was off. My signature was clearly forged. "This is fraud," I said, shaking my head. She shrugged. "Take it up with the courts if you want, but the sale has already gone through. The new owner is building a fence as we speak." My heart pounded. If I didn't act fast, I'd lose my land for good. I turned on my heel and walked out. I needed a lawyer fast, but first I had to stop that fence. Xander didn't waste a second. As soon as he stepped out of the HOA office, he headed straight for his property. The moment he rounded the corner, his stomach clenched. A crew was already hard at work, digging post holes and setting up wooden stakes for the fence. A man in an orange vest was barking orders at the workers, pointing at the boundary line that Xander knew for a fact was still legally his. He marched up to the man, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Stop what you're doing, right now." The foreman barely glanced at him before turning back to his clipboard. "We've got permits. If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Xander stepped closer, forcing the man to meet his gaze. "This land is still mine, and that means if you keep digging, you're trespassing." The foreman finally gave him more than a passing look, his expression shifting slightly. He exhaled loudly and lowered the clipboard. "Look, I'm just doing my job. The paperwork says this land belongs to the HOA now." Xander knew better than to argue with a contractor who had no stake in the situation. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped photos of the crew, the equipment, and most importantly, the work in progress. He made sure to get clear shots of the property markers that still showed his original boundary lines. Then he made a call. His friend, Marcus, a property attorney who had dealt with more than his fair share of HOA corruption cases, picked up on the second ring. "Tell me you're calling because Clarissa finally got herself arrested," Marcus said. "Not yet," Xander replied, "but I need you to help me make that happen." He explained the situation as he walked the perimeter of his land, taking more photos from different angles. He could hear Marcus sigh on the other end. "Forgery and fraudulent land sales. They're bold, I'll give them that," Marcus said. "Send me the documents they gave you and I'll start digging." "Already on it," Xander said, emailing scanned copies of the paperwork. Marcus hummed as he looked them over. "This is amateur work. The signature is an obvious forgery, and this so-called annexation, completely illegal. They'd need unanimous homeowner consent for something like this, and I guarantee they don't have that." Xander felt a surge of satisfaction. "Good. Then we can stop this before they get too far." "Not just stop it," Marcus said. "We can hit them where it hurts. I'll file for an immediate injunction to halt construction and freeze the HOA's accounts until this mess is sorted out. If we prove fraud, which we will, Clarissa and her little cronies are going to have a serious problem on their hands." Xander glanced back at the workers, who were now hesitating, watching him warily as they noticed the growing tension. He had a feeling they were starting to realize they might be on the wrong side of this. "How fast can you make this happen?" Xander asked, Marcus chuckled. "Give me a few hours. In the meantime, don't let them put that fence up." Xander ended the call just as the foreman approached him again, clearly annoyed. "Look, buddy, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but we have a job to do. Either step aside or I'll have to call the HOA. Xander folded his arms. "Go ahead, call them. But I'd suggest you hold off on installing anything, because by the end of the day, this project is getting shut down." The foreman narrowed his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked back to his crew. Xander knew he had bought himself some time. Now he just had to wait for Marcus to pull the legal trigger. A few hours later, Xander's phone buzzed. Marcus had done it. A judge had reviewed the case and issued an immediate injunction against the HOA, freezing their accounts and halting all construction efforts. Xander wasted no time spreading the news. He returned to the construction site, holding up his phone with the court order displayed. "This fence isn't going up. A judge just put a stop to everything. If you keep working, you'll be violating a court order." The foreman snatched a look at the screen and swore under his breath. He turned back to his crew and waved them off. "Pack it up, we're done here." As the workers began loading their equipment back into their trucks, Xander felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but he wasn't done yet. The real fight was just beginning. Clarissa and the HOA had gotten away with too much for too long. It was time to bring them down for good. Xander stood at the edge of his property, watching the construction crew pack up their equipment. The workers moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, as if they wanted to pretend they had never been there. He couldn't blame them. They were caught in the middle of something much bigger than they had signed up for. A black SUV rolled up a few minutes later, pulling into the curb with a sharp stop. The door swung open, and Clarissa stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her face was tight with irritation, her usual air of smug superiority faltering just slightly. She marched toward him, holding her phone in one hand, a thick folder in the other. "Xander, I don't know what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but you've seriously overstepped," she said, her voice clipped. He folded his arms, standing firm. "You're the one who overstepped when you forged my signature and tried to steal my land." Clarissa let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "Forgery, that's an outrageous accusation. The HOA acted within its rights, and you're making a fool of yourself by dragging this into court." Xander didn't flinch. "A judge disagrees. Your accounts are frozen. Your project is shut down. And soon you'll have to answer for fraud." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she recovered quickly, flipping open her folder. "You don't understand how this works," she said, pulling out what he assumed were more fabricated documents. "The HOA," he cut her off before she could launch into whatever nonsense excuse she had prepared. "Save it. The court order is in effect. Anything you say now won't change that." Clarissa clenched her jaw, gripping the folder tighter. "You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be. If you had just cooperated from the beginning, we wouldn't be here." Xander narrowed his eyes. "Cooperated? You mean rolled over and let you steal from me? Not happening." A car door slammed behind them. Xander turned to see Marcus stepping out of his vehicle, dressed in his usual no-nonsense suit, a thick binder tucked under one arm. He strode toward them with an easy confidence, nodding at Xander before turning his attention to Clarissa. "Clarissa Ziegler," Marcus greeted, his tone all business. "We need to talk." Clarissa forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And you are?" "Marcus Reed, property attorney representing Xander." He flipped open his binder and pulled out a document. "This is a cease and desist order, effective immediately. You are prohibited from making any further claims to this property until the matter is settled in court." Clarissa's fingers twitched as she took the document, scanning it quickly. Her jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "This is completely unnecessary." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Unnecessary? You forged a homeowner's signature to illegally annex land. You sold it without proper authorization. And now, your HOA accounts are frozen pending further investigation. I'd say this is very necessary." Clarissa's nostrils flared, the cracks in her composure starting to widen. "You're blowing this out of proportion. The HOA has managed this community for years without issue." Xander scoffed. "Without issue? You mean without getting caught?" Clarissa shot him a glare before turning her attention back to Marcus. This will be resolved internally. There's no need to drag the entire HOA into this mess. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Oh, but there is. See, once fraud is involved, this isn't just about one homeowner. It's about every single person in this community who might have been affected by similar practices. Clarissa's grip on the document tightened. You have no proof of that. Marcus smiled, slow and deliberate. Not yet, but we will. Xander watched as the color drained slightly from her face. She knew exactly what that meant. The moment other homeowners caught wind of what was happening, they'd start asking their own questions. And if even one more fraudulent case surfaced, the entire HOA board would be under scrutiny. Clarissa straightened her spine, her expression hardening. This isn't over. Xander met her gaze, unwavering. No, it's just beginning. She turned sharply on her heel and stalked back to her SUV, slamming the door shut before speeding off down the street. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. She's rattled, that's a good sign. Xander let out a small chuckle. Yeah, but she's not going to back down without a fight, Marcus nodded. Which is why we need to hit her with everything we've got. The more pressure we apply, the more likely she is to slip up. And when she does, we'll be there to bury her case for good. Xander nodded, determination settling deep in his gut. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now he had momentum on his side. And he wasn't going to stop until Clarissa and her corrupt HOA were exposed for exactly what they were. Xander didn't waste any time. The moment Clarissa sped off, he turned to Marcus with a plan forming in his mind. They had her rattled, but that wasn't enough. If they wanted to take down the HOA for good, they needed to dig deeper. Marcus was already flipping through his binder, his sharp eyes scanning the legal documents. Clarissa's going to try something desperate. She won't just roll over and let this go, he said, adjusting his tie. We need to get ahead of her. Xander nodded. She's been running this HOA like her own personal empire for years. If she forged my signature, there's a good chance she's done it to other homeowners too. Marcus tapped a section of his notes. Exactly. We need to talk to the other residents. If we can prove a pattern of fraud, we'll have more than enough to dismantle this operation permanently. Xander glanced around the neighborhood. Most people had been too afraid to stand up to the HOA, but he had a feeling that would change once they saw someone actually fighting back and winning. Without hesitation, he and Marcus started knocking on doors. At the first house, an elderly man named Mr. Calloway answered. He was cautious at first, peering at them through the gap in the door. But when Xander mentioned Clarissa's fraudulent land grab, the old man's expression darkened. That woman has been trying to push me out of my home for years, Mr. Calloway said, stepping onto his porch. She claimed I had unpaid fees, but I keep every receipt. When I proved her wrong, she conveniently lost my records. Marcus jotted down notes. Did she ever make changes to your property boundaries? Mr. Calloway's eyes narrowed. Last year, she tried to claim my backyard was HOA land, said it had been annexed. I fought it, but she made my life miserable until I gave in. Xander clenched his fists. She's been pulling this scam on multiple homeowners. They moved to the next house, and then the next. Each story followed a similar pattern. A young couple had been fined thousands for so-called violations that never existed. A single mother had nearly lost her driveway after the HOA claimed it was a common area. A retired veteran had been harassed for refusing to pay for community improvements that never materialized. By the time Xander and Marcus finished their rounds, they had gathered more than a dozen testimonies, each one pointing to a clear pattern of fraud and abuse. Marcus flipped through the notes. This is better than I expected. We're not just dealing with one forged document. We're looking at years of systematic corruption. Xander exhaled sharply. Then we take it all to the authorities. The HOA's done. Just as they were about to leave, a voice called out from behind them. Wait. They turned to see a woman in her mid-30s jogging toward them. She looked nervous but determined. I heard you were looking into the HOA, she said, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. I have something you need to see. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through messages before handing it to Marcus. My husband used to work with Clarissa. He handled some of the HOA's paperwork before he quit. He always said something was off, but I didn't realize how bad it was until I found this. Marcus scanned the screen, his eyes widening. Then he turned the phone around so Xander could see. It was an email exchange between Clarissa and another board member. Clarissa had written, "We need to push the annexation paperwork through before anyone questions it. If we get resistance, we'll adjust the signatures like last time. No one reads the fine print." Xander's jaw tightened. "That's it. That's the smoking gun," Marcus grinned. "This isn't just fraud, this is conspiracy, and now we have direct evidence tying Clarissa to it." The woman nodded. "I can testify if you need me to." Xander reached out and shook her hand. "You just helped bring this whole thing down." They wasted no time. Marcus forwarded the evidence to the district attorney's office, along with the sworn testimonies they had gathered. Within hours, an investigation was officially opened. By the next morning, Clarissa's worst nightmare had come true. 2 unmarked cars pulled up in front of her house, and uniformed officers stepped out. Moments later, Clarissa was escorted out in handcuffs, her face pale with shock. As she was placed in the back of the squad car, Xander stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Marcus walked up beside him. "Looks like she won't be running the HOA anymore." Xander let out a satisfied breath. No, she won't. The neighborhood was finally free, and the HOA's reign of terror was officially over. Xander leaned against his truck, watching as the officers drove away with Clarissa in the backseat. The neighborhood had gone quiet, but he could feel the tension shifting. People were stepping out of their homes, peering from porches and windows, whispering among themselves. For years, they had been under the HOA's thumb. Now, for the first time, that grip was breaking. Marcus shut his binder with a snap. "She's going to fight this, you know," he said, eyes scanning the street. "People like her don't go down without trying to drag everyone else with them." Xander exhaled through his nose. "Let her try. The court order isn't just freezing the HOA's accounts, it's forcing a full audit. Everything she's done is going to come to light." A voice cut through the murmurs around them. "What happens to the rest of the HOA board?" Xander turned to see Mr. Calloway making his way over, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. The old man's expression was wary, but there was something else there, hope, maybe. Marcus adjusted his cuffs. "Depends. If they were involved, they'll be held accountable. If they were just following orders, they might try to jump ship before it sinks." Another neighbor, a woman in her 50s with a sharp gaze, crossed her arms. "And if they don't, if they try to keep things running like nothing happened," Xander pushed off his truck, "then we make sure they don't get the chance." The small crowd around them was growing. Residents who had been too scared to speak up before were now looking at each other, at Xander, at the empty HOA office down the street. A younger man, probably in his early 30s, stepped forward. "I work in finance. If you need someone to go through whatever records they have left, I can help." A woman with a clipboard tucked under her arm nodded. "I've been keeping track of all the fines they've issued for the last 2 years. Most of them don't add up." An older gentleman adjusted his glasses. "I know a few people at the county clerk's office. I can check if there were any other shady land transfers." Marcus glanced at Xander, a small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like you started something bigger than just getting your land back." Xander met the eyes of the people around him. "Clarissa ran this place like a dictatorship. That ends today, but we can't just remove her. We have to make sure this never happens again." The crowd murmured in agreement, more people stepping forward, volunteering their skills, sharing their experiences. A heavy-set man in a construction vest spoke up. "I did some work for the HOA last year. Clarissa always made sure invoices were vague. If we dig through the records, I bet we'll find a lot of misused funds." A woman with 2 teenagers at her side frowned. "She tried to fine me for having my kids' bikes in the driveway, said it lowered property values, but I looked up the rules, there's nothing about that in the bylaws." Marcus held up a hand. "All right, here's what we do. First, we compile everything, every suspicious fine, every forged signature, every misused dollar. We get it in front of the judge overseeing the case. Second, we push for a full board election. If we get enough homeowners to vote, we can remove the remaining members and start fresh." Xander nodded. "And third, we make sure this HOA never has the power to do this again. No more secret land grabs, no more fraudulent fees. Everything has to be transparent." The energy in the crowd shifted. People were no longer just angry, they were determined. A woman near the back raised a hand. "How do we make sure they don't just cover everything up?" Xander's lips pressed into a thin line. "We don't give them the chance." They split into groups. Some went to gather paperwork, others to spread the word to neighbors who weren't there. A few, including Marcus, headed straight for the HOA office, intent on securing any remaining records before anyone on the board could tamper with them. Xander went with them. The office was locked, but Marcus had already anticipated that. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. A few minutes later, a county official arrived with a court order giving them access. Inside, the place was a mess of filing cabinets, half-organized paperwork, and a desk that still had Clarissa's personal items scattered across it. Marcus wasted no time flipping through documents. He pulled out a thick folder and let out a low whistle. Bingo, expense reports. And they do not look good. Xander scanned the pages. Money had been funneled into vague improvement projects that never happened. Large sums had been paid to companies with no clear connection to the neighborhood. Some checks had been written directly to individuals, with no explanation. Then, at the bottom of the stack, Xander found a form that made his stomach turn. It was a transfer of ownership for another property in the neighborhood, one belonging to a family who had mysteriously moved out last year. The signature was just like his had been off, but close enough to fool someone who wasn't looking too hard. Clarissa had been doing this for years. Marcus met his gaze. This isn't just fraud. This is criminal embezzlement. She could be looking at serious prison time. Xander nodded. Then let's make sure she gets exactly what she deserves. They spent the next several hours gathering everything they could. By the time they left the office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Neighbors were still outside, talking in small groups, sharing stories, comparing notes. The fear that had ruled this place for so long was being replaced by something stronger resolve. Marcus stretched, rolling his shoulders. "We'll submit everything first thing tomorrow. Once the auditor gets their hands on this, the entire HOA structure is going to collapse." Xander glanced around at the people who had come together, people who had been isolated by fear and control for so long. "Good," he said, "because this neighborhood belongs to us, not them." And for the first time in years, it finally felt true. Xander barely slept that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the HOA's fraudulent paperwork spread out before him, highlighted and marked with notes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clarissa's face when she was led away in handcuffs, shocked, furious, but still convinced she could talk her way out of it. He knew better. People like her didn't go down without trying to drag others with them. His phone buzzed, and he grabbed it without thinking. Marcus had sent another message, short and straight to the point. The county auditors had officially launched their investigation, and the remaining HOA board members were already scrambling. They knew the hammer was about to fall. By sunrise, Xander was back outside, watching as his neighbors gathered. People who had once kept their heads down were now openly discussing everything they had been too afraid to before. Some were digging through their own records, looking for discrepancies in fees, while others were already discussing what would come next. The HOA's control had been shattered, and the community was ready to take back what was theirs. Marcus arrived not long after, stepping out of his car with a folder tucked under his arm. His usual confidence was tinged with something else: anticipation. Clarissa's grip on the neighborhood had been absolute for years, but now everything was unraveling faster than she could have ever anticipated. They met at Xander's truck, away from the growing crowd. Marcus handed him a fresh stack of documents. "The audit is turning up more than we expected," Marcus said. "Clarissa wasn't just forging signatures. She was funneling HOA funds into personal accounts. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars." Xander thumbed through the pages, the sheer scale of the corruption making his blood boil. "She was robbing homeowners blind. And now she's got nowhere to hide," Marcus said. "The DA's office is already preparing charges beyond fraud. She could be looking at serious jail time." Xander let out a slow breath, the weight of the fight finally starting to shift. "What about the rest of the board? Are they going down with her?" Marcus glanced toward the HOA office where a few remaining board members had gathered, looking nervous. Some of them are already trying to cut deals. They'll throw Clarissa under the bus to save themselves. But the ones who were actively involved, they won't be walking away clean. Xander folded the documents under his arm. Then let's make sure none of them escape this. By midday, the county investigator had arrived along with a court officer. The HOA office was formally locked down, all records seized. The remaining board members were confronted with the evidence one by one. Some tried to deny involvement, others pleaded ignorance, but it was too late. Everything was documented. Xander watched as the community gathered, murmuring as the truth was laid bare. Homeowners who had been fined into submission, who had been threatened with foreclosure or forced to give up parts of their property, now saw the full extent of the HOA's corruption. One of the board members, a man in his late 50s with a thinning hairline and a perpetually nervous expression, finally cracked under the pressure. He admitted that Clarissa had orchestrated everything, manipulating records, strong-arming homeowners, and pocketing money while pretending it was for community projects. The crowd's reaction was swift. What had once been whispers of frustration turned into open outrage. Xander stepped forward before things could spiral. We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure this never happens again. The HOA is finished. Now we take back control of our neighborhood. The reaction was immediate. Homeowners cheered, some shaking hands, others hugging. The fear that had kept them silent for years had been replaced with something stronger: determination. Marcus stood beside Xander, arms crossed. You did it. You took her down. Xander glanced at the locked HOA office, then back at the people around him. We all did. By the time the sun set, the neighborhood was changed. The HOA was dissolved, its funds frozen, and its corrupt leadership dismantled. Clarissa was facing years behind bars, and the community had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. For the first time in a long time, Xander felt something he hadn't before: peace. The fight was over, justice had won, and the neighborhood was finally free.